Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and in this video I'm going to show you how to do couching using a sewing machine. I've got a couple of videos already that show you how to do couching by hand. This is showing you how to use your sewing machine to get the same effect. First, I'm going to just show you in general what couching is. Couching is when you are sewing a three-dimensional piece to the surface of your fabric. And basically you're just zigzagging over the piece. These are things that you can't sew through. So that's just the general introduction to kind of what couching is. I'll show you specifics for all of these materials in a second. But first, this is the foot that you're going to need to use. I have a Bernina, so I use the Bernina foot 12C. But these are available in universal feet and feet for all different kinds of machines. I just want to show you the things you're looking for. The main thing is this channel that runs through the bottom of the foot. So I'm going to turn it so that you can see with the white fabric behind it. See how it's got that channel, that groove in the bottom of the foot? That's the number one characteristic you're looking for. That's what your three-dimensional stuff is going to roll through so that your foot isn't squashing it. Some feet will also have this hole on the surface, and I'm going to show you that's kind of an optional feature. It can help keep the piping or whatever centered in what you're doing, but you don't have to use it, and not all feet are going to have that. So that's the foot that you're going to use, and I'll show it to you on the machine and in use in a minute. But next I want to talk about the different kinds of things you can couch. So we're going to look first at this. This is just bead chain. It's what you would string necklaces on. You've seen it a million times before. It has this kind of a clasp on it usually. And I picked this one first because this is what you're most likely to find in the trim department of the fabric store. Even if it looks beaded, it's not a string of loose beads on a chain. Those beads are fixed, and if you cut one off, the rest of them don't all come falling off of it. So that's the first kind that I'm going to show you. And I did it here with contrasting thread so you can see really what's happening. You've got a simple zigzag stitch going back and forth over these beads. And ideally you want it to look like this, where it's going in, where you've got a stitch in between each bead. You would obviously do it in matching thread, either match it to your background or match it to what you're stitching on there. Just do a little test and see what you like the look of better. One of the trickiest things about couching is knowing how to start and finish. So at the top here, I did not backstitch. You would normally want to backstitch, otherwise your stitches, just like any other sewing, can start to pull loose. But if you don't like the look of the backstitch, and some people don't like seeing that extra stitching, you can take your tail here, the tail that you're left with at the start of your sewing, and just thread it through, just thread it into a needle and pull it through to the back of your sewing, and you won't be able to see it. You can knot it back there and hide it. So that's one thing, is taking care of the ends of your stitching. Here I just backstitched and then cut it close. The other thing is taking care of the bits of whatever you're couching. And in this case, since this is metal, I need to use some wire cutters. But you can just snip it off after the last bead. And because they're not beads strung loose on a string, you don't need to worry about those sliding off. So you can just leave it like that and it'll be nice and secure. So that's the first possibility. And again, that's going to be most of what you see in the trim section of the fabric store. But you can also couch regular beads that you'll find in the bead store, in a bead shop, jewelry making shop, or in the beading section of your fabric store if you've got that. So these are beads that are actually loose on the string. If you look at them, you'll see that they will slide back and forth. So these, you handle everything else the same. I just backstitched a little bit at the beginning and at the end, and I did this one curved so you could see that couching can also be done curves. You can't do really tight curves on the machine. You could if you were hand stitching, but on the machine you're kind of limited to more gentle curves. But I want to show you what you need to do to finish the couched piece at the end when it's loose beads. So when you start sewing, it's really difficult to position the machine right at the beginning of your bead, so you're most likely to have some beads kind of trailing off loose at the end. And it's really easy. You're just going to pull those off, and then your beads are going to be on a string, and you're going to thread a needle with that. Let me get this. See if I can get the needle threaded. So I got my needle threaded, and then I actually like to take it backwards, back over, instead of going in right there, I'm going to go back over those tack stitches and right to the head of the beads. And I'm just going to pull those threads through to the back. And you can see that that leaves a nice clean finish on the front. And then on the back, I can just knot it. It doesn't matter. The threads are going to be buried. So that's how you finish if you've got loose beads on a string, which is more what you're going to find in a bead shop or in the jewelry section of your store. So on this one, I wanted to show you, so on these, I left the zigzag stitch fairly wide. On this one, I narrowed it a bit so I could show you that you can make the stitching less visible. You just want to be really careful not to get into a situation where you've narrowed it so much that your needle is actually hitting the beads, because you don't want to break a needle on any kind of hard beads that you might be running through the machine. But I did pretty much make those stitches disappear. And I'm actually going to take this to the machine, and when I show you the demonstration on the machine, I want to show you just a little thing that you have to keep in mind when you're doing loose beads like this. As you go through the machine, you're actually going to have to hold the beads up in place, because otherwise the foot can tend to push them, spread them out on your string, and you want to have a nice continuous line of beads. So I'm going to leave this attached on there because we're going to show you that on the machine. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is some cording. Cording is actually really, really easy to couch down. This is just satin cord. So I'm going to demonstrate that. The trickiest thing about this is hiding those ends. You could conceivably thread that maybe through a really big eye needle and pull the end of your cord through to the back, but most cording or piping that you use is going to be too big to do that with. You could also bury it in your seam. So if we zoom out and look at this entire quilt block, and think of this as a quilt block, because I usually am doing this on quilt blocks. If these are the sides of my block, I could make a nice kind of wavy line and couch that down like that, and my ends are going to be buried in the seams. So that's really nice if you can design whatever you're doing so that your braid or your cording or whatever you're couching down gets hidden in the seams. You don't need to worry about the ends. But that's not always the case. So I wanted to show you what you can do if it's going to be starting and stopping in the middle of a block. So maybe you wanted to do some three-dimensional cat whiskers or something. So in that case, this stuff and almost all piping really frays at the ends when you cut it. So you need to use something called fray check. So I'm just going to cut a little piece. That's all that I'm going to stitch down today. And I've already treated one end. But fray check, that's this product, and you can get it. One bottle of this lasts forever. It'll dry out before you use all of it. And you just want to get a tiny little dot on the end here. I'm just trying to make sure I get a tiny, tiny dot so I'm not, there it goes, I'm not squeezing too hard. There we go, just a tiny dot on the end. And you can barely see it, and it'll dry clear. And if you don't have any fray check, you can always use a little bit of clear nail polish, but I think fray check works really well, and it won't, clear nail polish can sometimes yellow a little bit over time, so you're safer using the fray check. So I'm going to just let this dry and show you the demo on the beads here, and then this will be dry by then, and I can show you how to couch down the cord, and that'll show you also just starting and finishing. Okay, so I've got the foot in place, and for loose beads like this, you do not want to use that little hole. It'll tend to actually separate the beads, which is what we're trying not to do. So I'm just going to pick up where I left off on this, lower my presser foot back down. So you can see that the beads are going right through that channel. So that's keeping the presser foot from pushing them out of the way. If you tried to do this with a presser foot that didn't have that little channel in there, those beads would be going all over the place. It would just be really not fun. So I'm going to do a couple back stitches here. And now, before I go forward, I'm just going to push these beads forward. And then I'm going to hold them pushed forward as I sew. And because they're not going through that channel, I do have to worry about keeping them in the middle of that little tube there. And just keep going. And just keep making sure that all the beads are pushed up together and that they're not slowly separating as you go. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and tie a knot. And you can see I basically just stitched down a bunch more beads there. Now I'm going to show you how to stitch down that cording, and that we actually are going to use that tube, so I wanted to show you that. So my fray check feels dry, and I need to make my stitch just a little bit wider because the piping is a little bit wider than the other stuff was. So I'm going to put this right through there, and you'll see when I lower my presser foot, it's going to help keep that centered. See how having it in that hole just keeps it right centered in the little tunnel. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to back stitch a couple stitches, and then I'm going to start stitching forward. Now normally I would use a matching thread, but I wanted you guys to be able to see what's happening with the thread. So I've got a really highly contrasting berry color in there. And I'm just going to go right to the end of this cord. I think I can get one more stitch in there. Okay, now I'm going to back stitch a little bit, tie a knot, and pull it out so you can see. You know, let's take it back to the table so that the light is better. So here you can see I've got nice even stitching on there. The zigzag stitching is really going to show. So you can use contrast thread like I did here for that kind of effect, but you can also make it match your cord or whatever you're stitching down. This is exactly the way you want it to look. You want the stitches to fall on either side of the cord and not go through the cord at all and not compress it at all. Now, the tricky thing is the ends. And on this one, I feel like I managed to get it pretty secure at the ends just with that back stitching. If you feel like you weren't able to get enough visibility on yours, so you couldn't get right up to the end of the cording, it's especially hard at the beginning, pull it out. Don't worry about trying to do that with a machine. You can always do a couple of extra stitches just at the ends with some hand couching, just to cover up those ends. You can almost give it like a little satin stitched cap just to completely hide the end. But with that fray check, you don't need to worry about those ends fraying at all. So this is going to stay nice and neat on there. So on this house, you can see that I added some of that metallic beaded cord to the roof of the house. And on this one, I added some braided yarn to that tree. And on this one, I added those pearly beads to the edge of the snow. So that's it. It's actually really easy to do couching on the machine, but you absolutely have to have a couching foot. It might also be called a braid foot or a cord foot or a piping foot. But you want to look for that little channel in there that's going to give you a space to run that three-dimensional stuff through that you are couching down. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.